Good evening. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. Thanks for everybody for coming this year to our very special Constitution Day evening annual event. And this one's especially special because of the timeliness of the topic and the importance of the topic. So, as I'm sure many of you know, this involves an important case that received a lot of national attention, Held versus Montana, which revolved around the passage in the Montana State Constitution that each person shall maintain and improve a clean and healthful environment in Montana for present and future generations. The state and each person shall maintain and improve a clean and healthful environment in Montana for present and future generations. We have four special panelists here tonight to talk about this with us. So when I introduce you, just raise your hand and wave your hand, please. So first we have Barbara Chilcott. She joined the Western Environmental Law Center in 2021 after 15 years of work on water law and policy in Montana. She's originally from South Carolina. Barbara earned a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and her law degree from the University of Montana Law School. She previously worked to restore in-stream flows across Montana as a project manager and executive director of a statewide water trust. From 2010 through 2016, as a legal director for the Clark Fork Coalition, Barbara developed and advanced strategies for protecting and restoring the Clark Fork River watershed. And then she joined the Western Environmental Law Center. Melissa Hornbein. She joined the Western Environmental Law Center in January 2020 after working in state and federal government. She holds a BS in botany and a BA in anthropology from the University of Washington and obtained her Juris Doctorate from the Hastings College of Law. The next year, she earned a Master's in Environmental Studies from the University of Montana. Before practicing as an attorney, Melissa worked in the field as a botanist biological technician for various academic and governmental entities, including the National Park Service and the U.S. Geologic Survey. She worked as an attorney with the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation on tribal and federal water rights issues, and as an assistant U.S. attorney in Montana with the Department of Justice. And she works with the Western Environmental Law Center's Climate and Energy Program. Eva Lighthiser, is that the right? Okay, great. She is 17 years old, at least at the time of this case. Are you still 17? 17. And she's very concerned about the future of Montana and the environment here. She remembers the flooding, and she's from Livingston and was one of the youth plaintiffs in the case. Dr. Patricia Heiser is a professor of Earth and Environmental Science at Carroll College. She's a graduate of the University of Vermont and has a PhD from the University of Alaska and teaches many courses on earth science and environmental science at Carroll. Okay, so there's a few things I have to say. First of all, my name is Jeremy Johnson. I'm the Department Chair of Political Science and International Relations and the Director of the Constitutional Studies Program at Carroll College. Carroll College seeks to provide a campus intellectual environment that encourages the pursuit of truth, critical thinking, responsible decision-making, civil debate, and respectful dialogue. Carroll College neither agrees nor disagrees with views expressed, but rather provides a forum so that each person attending may hear, contemplate, and discuss the ideas and opinions presented. So, after this is all over, we'll each give you a cup, a Carroll College Political Science Department cup for coming. So we get the gift for being here. Okay, yes. So we will now start off with Patricia Heiser. So there you go.
Can you hear me if I don't use that?
You should use your microphone.
Yeah, you're right. All right. Thanks. When Jeremy asked me, Dr. Johnson, asked me to do this, I thought, well, I didn't know what parts, how a litigation about climate change, would go about. So I ended up, they gave me the copy of the findings, and he asked me to provide kind of a context of climate and climate change. So I'm really going to sort of step back a little bit and talk about, well, some of the things that were in the finding, but then also why it might be that Montana is where this could happen first, because... Is that on yet? No, not yet. Oh, there we go. It's a blank screen right now. Why this was able to happen in Montana, and that's partly because of the climate scientists that we have in Montana, the data that we have in Montana, and the Montana climate assessment. A lot of other states aren't as far along or have as great of a climate assessment program. So that's a little bit about climate. I'm going to teach whole semester courses in climate change. So in 10 minutes, I'm going to kind of give you what's relevant here. So. So I just started out with reading the findings from the court case, and I had to skip over the little bit early part because, oh my God. But there was different, you guys will talk about this, but there were all these motions and things that went on, and I was like, oh dear. But then I got down to the climate and climate assessment part. And so I really pulled out some quotes from the judge that were sort of entered into the findings. And I guess I just want to support some of that. I think in some corners, I hope not anyway, that climate change and the impacts of climate change and the evidence for climate change is still in question, or the causes of climate change. And it's very complicated. I'm going to talk about a little bit how complicated the models are. But I found it interesting that the finding, very clearly stated, science is unequivocal that dangerous impacts are occurring due to human activities, primarily from fossil fuels. And this evidence, so this is from basically two major, and others, but two climate scientists in Montana, Dr. Kathy Whitlock and Dr. Steve Running. And they are both not just great climate scientists in Montana, they are national scientists and actually internationally recognized as amazing climate scientists, very rigorous. And Kathy is one of the authors on the Montana Climate Assessment. And she's also worked on climate and the impacts on humans in Montana, in the US, and also in Mongolia. So these are, to have in a state the size of Montana, the small population of Montana, and to have climate scientists and a climate assessment of this rigor is a great thing, and I think helped. Of course, the lawyers are very great too, but having the information on climate science is really helpful. I just put some of these are direct quotes, but some points about global atmospheric changes in CO2. Most of you, everyone in my class, has seen this curve from Mauna Loa, the increase in CO2 since the 1950s or 60s. Excuse me. And that we have gone from 280, 300 ppms in the atmosphere to now we're up to 420, I think. We crossed 420 ppm in our atmosphere. So the wiggles on this curve, our annual cycle, is in summer and winter, plants extract more CO2, produce more oxygen seasonally. So any CO2 curve, locally or globally, will have a seasonal variation. But the change is sort of unavoidable. And our temperature, global temperature has risen, and it's evidence ocean temperature, atmospheric temperatures have all risen along with increased CO2. And you've seen millions of graphs, and I can go into some of these, where's the average, and it's an anomaly, how different over a period of average is our climate. But it's not even a debate that our climate is warming, the globe is warming. And it doesn't always just mean getting warm. It could be, as you know now, and I'm sure you're watching the news, it has increase of severity of storms, increase of frequency of some storms. Sometimes it can even be really cold events, like when the polar vortex pushes down, we're decreasing the gradient of temperature from the equator to the poles, and it allows sort of some of those stronger, the jet stream to push down further and create much colder temperatures, extremes in the winter, and so that's not necessarily climate change isn't real because we get some cold snaps. It's part of the whole system. And I thought this part two parts, Montana and other areas in higher latitudes are heating more quickly than lower latitudes, and that has to do with both land mass and kind of carbon and energy budgets. And I thought this last quote, that until atmospheric GHG is greenhouse gases, are reduced, these extreme events and other weather events and climate, droughts, heat waves, will be more frequently at greater magnitude, and the plaintiffs will be unable to live in clean and healthy lives in Montana. So I think that's kind of the core of this that you guys will explain more about. And I pulled also something out of the IPCC report. I think this was also in the findings, but there's no argument or debate about whether temperature is rising. There's lots of fluctuations. Things go up and down. We have cold years and warm years. But an average temperature is rising. I think it's been 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit in Montana in the last 60 years or 80 years. And this is the IPCC, so the International Panel on Climate Change, said in the near term, every region is projected to face increased hazards, multiple risks to ecosystems and humans, and hazards with heat-related mortality and morbidity, foodborne diseases. And those are up there, but what I wanted to point out were the parentheses where it says medium to high confidence, depending on region, very high confidence, high confidence. And that is a component of climate reports and assessments that has been increasingly important and included in reports, because people try to argue statistics, and sometimes, and I'll show you how in the Montana report, you know, it might match the records well, or there's variability, so we're not confident in the model results, or it matches reality well. So the fact that climate assessments globally and Montana are assessing our confidence in the data itself, whether it's good or bad, is also a very important part, I think. So I'm going to kind of give a big plug for the Montana climate assessment. There's a link right here. This is just the executive summary, but it's chapters, it's huge, it's all online, and there's a summary about Montana's climate system in general and climate dynamics. Then there's whole chapters on Montana's water, impacts on forests, impacts on agriculture. And in 2021, there's a new report out by the same group on health and climate in Montana. So I think I'll click that really. That's okay. This is the table of contents. It's much bigger in the real one, and there's really detailed reports on both the observed climate change and environmental changes we've seen to date, and what we're predicting for the future, and impacts on health and economics as well. Just to do a really quick 30-second lesson on kind of how do we predict climate and climate change. You hear about these models, and that there's climate models. What are they? How do they work? And I am not going to go into all of that. But a lot of them are called GCMs, or global climate models. And they're huge mathematical models that represent kind of components of the Earth system, primarily about the energy balance, right? We know that solar energy comes in, it can get trapped, absorbed, bounce off, reflect. Where's my climate science class? So there's a lot of things that can happen, and as we increase CO2 concentration, we're holding more heat onto the Earth's surface, basically. But how that occurs and where it occurs and why it's different in different places, our understanding of that comes from these mathematical models that we built. And it's based on latitude and longitude, what's happening, what's the annual solar radiation in Arctic and equatorial climates, what dark clouds are in there. And these have evolved. I think there's 30 or 40 now, models from institutions, governments, all over the world. And so they kind of run these scenarios, right? So what's going to happen if? And in the Montana report, there's kind of these 4 curves. These RCP stands for Representative Concentration Pathways. So what's going to happen if we just continue business as usual and let CO2 do what we're doing now? This is where we're going to be. We're here, right? We're now at over 400. There we go with our, if we don't do anything. The other scenarios are pathways 4.5, 6, and 8.5. So 8.5 is business as usual. This one at P6 is that they kind of turn the dials, right? You turn up how much CO2 we put in the climate system. And that is if we take some sort of measures and the emissions peak, the emissions amounts peak at 2080 and then start to go down. Scenario 4.5 is that they peak at 2040 and then decline. And the Paris Agreement is somewhere in between those two. And then here's the greenhouse peak 2010, the greenhouse emissions peak between 2010 and 2020 and then decline by the end of the century, but we've missed that one already. So anyway, the Montana climate assessment kind of uses these two, business as usual, and this one in here is sort of an average. And so I'm not going to go into these too much, but there's pages and pages of predicted temperature changes, variability, seasonality, frost-free days, days over 90 degrees. And there's kind of the major conclusions is that annual temperature is predicted to increase through the end of the century, all models and all emission scenarios, all regions of Montana. They broke Montana into kind of geographic regions. You think about mountains and prairies and things that affect climate. Here they often put it sometimes by month, so where we see changes by month. And here, I'm not going to go into it too much, but this is their providing their certainty or their model agreement. So they run these models, and then they compare them with the information we've already seen, recent changes in temperature, and where we already are. Not with what we're predicting, but they post-predict and kind of test the model a little bit. And so if its agreement is greater than 80%, these guys are outlined in black. So the temperature predictions are feeling pretty strong. This is the precipitation, and again, there's pages and pages of this and more. But I just wanted to kind of introduce you. But they said they're worrying that rising temperatures are going to cause reduced snowpack, shifting stream flows, maybe more floods. Water supplies are a great concern. And rising temperatures may also make droughts worse. But their confidence is it's harder in the precipitation. So they're not, here's interannual variability, so how it changes from one year to another. And you can see these red boxes. I'm just putting up these up here as an example of, we have these numerical models, they predict what climate's going to do, what we think it's going to do, our best guess, and then test it against what we know. And I just kind of wanted to provide a little bit of background into that. I could spend 2-3 hours or semesters talking about it. But I'd be happy to answer questions about climate, but I just wanted to set a little bit of a stage that Montana's climate assessment is, I think it's probably the best one in the country. I haven't looked at all of them, but it was a leader in states creating their own climate assessment reports, and it was years and years in the making. And a lot of researchers, a lot of work, and a lot of rigor has gone into it. And now we have the human health, climate change and human health report as well. So I encourage you, just type climate assessment Montana, and both of these will be there, and you can access them very easily. So that's all I got. Thanks.
Should I stand or sit?
Whatever you'd like to do. What's comfortable?
This room is crazy. I'm just going to say, like, all of you are just way up there, but I'm just going to sit here and look at you like this. And hello, thank you so much, Patricia, for setting the stage. And, again, my name is Barbara Chilcott. I'm an attorney with the Western Environmental Law Center here in Helena. Melissa Hornbein here and I were fortunate enough to be one of the several attorneys on the legal team for this case. And it was really cool to have the trial, happen here in our hometown. I guess I'm just curious of those of you who are here, how many were able to either attend in person or watch some of the trial? Cool. Okay. Oh, nice. Yeah, it's nice to be able to stream it. Cool. So I just want to give a little overview of the case and how we came to bring this case in Montana, and then I'll turn it over to Eva and Melissa to provide their perspectives as well. And I think the one thing you said, Patricia, about the climate assessment being so amazing, and we have just these amazing scientists here in Montana who were also served as our expert witnesses in the case. Drs. Running and Dr. Whitlock were two of those, of course. And so, yeah, the data was so great to have in terms of, you know, where we are in Montana and where we've been, and that was huge for just being able to tell the story. And the other side of that is we have basically a government in Montana who both promoted the use of fossil, or does promote the use of fossil fuels, and also prevents agencies from, you know, looking at the effects that burning fossil fuels in Montana causes. So those two things really created for us a perfect kind of set of facts and law to have a successful case here in Montana. And so just to back up, so the case is Held versus the state of Montana. It was named, the named plaintiff is Ricky Held. She was the only of the 16 plaintiffs who was an adult at the time the complaint was filed. And so when the case was filed, the ages of the 16 plaintiffs ranged from 2 to 18 years old. And and they're from all over the state, and Eva can talk about her experience being from Livingston and kind of the specific, you know, climate harm she has experienced, and was able to provide testimony, really compelling testimony in court about that, as did the other plaintiffs who testified. So the case was brought in March of 2020. That's when the complaint was filed. And it was filed in partnership with a group based in Eugene, Oregon called Our Children's Trust. And they are the ones who have developed this kind of legal theory of change. And you've probably heard of the Juliana case in federal court, and they're that's Our Children's Trust as well. And they have cases now in most every state in the country as well as internationally. So, but Montana is the first, and so far the only one of those cases that have gone to trial and received a favorable decision. So again, complaint was filed in March of 2020. The claims in that complaint were fairly straightforward. We argued that the state of Montana's energy policy promoted the use of fossil fuels above all else. And that on the other hand, through a law called the Montana Environmental Policy Act, the state government was prevented from looking at climate impacts in their environmental review documents for projects. So the law said, you know, you can't look, and paraphrasing, you can't look at climate change, even if you know that this project will result in greenhouse gas emissions. So we argued that those provisions violated the plaintiff's constitutional rights, and so this is a constitutional climate case, which means that the claims were all kind of grounded in Montana's constitution. And Dr. Johnson read to you those provisions as far as the clean and healthful provisions go, and we also argued that not only did those laws violate the plaintiff's right to a clean and healthful environment, but also to seek safety, health, and happiness, individual dignity, equal protection, and failed to protect our public trust resources, meaning our, you know, air, water, etc. And so the case, the complaint was filed, and what generally happens in cases like this is the defendants move to dismiss the case. They did that, and the judge ruled, allowed the case to proceed in August of 2021. So we had to wait kind of a year and a half or so for the case to then be able to move forward. After that, we started a process called discovery. And so that means basically we are asking the state of Montana to produce information to us that they have in their records about, you know, what they've known about climate change. It resulted in about, you know, 50,000 pages of documents being produced into the record. And there were, like, I think around 36 or so depositions taken. Most of the plaintiffs were deposed, including Eva, and maybe she might want to talk about that experience, which, I don't know, have any of you been deposed? In this, yeah. It's not that fun. So the plaintiffs were very, I can't speak enough about how brave and steadfast all the plaintiffs were in this case. It took a long time to get from the complaint being filed to trial, and they just did such a great job sticking with it, and really, it wasn't easy, so always. So throughout the discovery process, we concluded that, and after that, the state filed a number of different kind of motions with the court to just have the case dismissed or certain provisions dismissed. The state also tried to go up twice to the Montana Supreme Court to have the Supreme Court kind of take over the case from the district court judge, Judge Seeley, basically arguing that she wasn't doing the right thing. And the Supreme Court kind of rejected those attempts twice. So, the state basically pulled out all the stops to prevent us from going to trial, but we did get to trial, and that was kind of the whole point of all of this, is to be able to present our evidence through these plaintiffs who told their stories, and also through our expert witnesses, and we really just told the story starting kind of from the beginning when the Montana Constitution was adopted in 1972, the amended Constitution, all the way through to, exactly what Patricia just talked about. What is climate science? What's happening in Montana? What are the health impacts? What is Montana's contribution in terms of its contribution to climate change and how that is actually significant, which the state kind of argued the whole time that it wasn't. And so the trial lasted 7 days. It was intense and very just historic. And so fortunately, we felt so good about how the trial went, and it went exactly how we wanted, and we felt even better when we got an order from Judge Seeley last month, finding in favor of our plaintiffs on all of the claims that we had remaining, and we just felt, really good about that. So it was the best order that we could have hoped for, honestly, and it's like 103 pages, but I would recommend all of you just getting a copy of it, looking at it online and reading it, because it's just so great how the findings that you pulled from, and just, she just did such a good job of kind of telling the story, and I kind of wanted to stop there and leave it to Melissa. I'm not sure what order we want to do. If Eva wants to talk, and then I'd love for you to talk about the order.
Yeah, I would love for Eva to talk and just share her experience of being a plaintiff. I think that's going to be more interesting just for both.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Eva. I guess I'll just start with kind of how I originally got involved. I was like 13, and I worried about climate change a lot, and it was something that was on my mind, and it was this burden that I thought about all the time, and I could see the effects of it beginning to happen in my home, and seeing that sort of put me in this place where, I had a lot of anxiety about it, and just, it was on my mind a lot. So when I found out that our Children's Trust was going to file a lawsuit against the state of Montana, I was really interested, and I decided to join as a plaintiff in the case. Sort of way back, this was like 3 years ago, we filed it on my 14th birthday. It was like right at the beginning of COVID, so everything was kind of crazy and wild, and there was just a lot of waiting and sort of anticipation and just wondering how it was going to turn out. And like fast forward a long time, getting to trial and getting to like, the discovery period was tough. Being deposed, as Barbara mentioned earlier, was an incredibly interesting experience. It was like three and a half hours of basically being sort of grilled on my intelligence, my knowledge of climate change, and all sorts of stuff. Like I remember being asked the question, what is your definition of democracy? And that sort of thing, and it went on for a very, very long time. It was a bit grueling, but leading up to trial, yeah, there was a lot of anticipation. I was really nervous about testifying in court. I was like, oh, what if I say the wrong thing, or what if I fumble over my words? And eventually it was June 12th, and the trial started, and when I got called to the stand, it was kind of clear in my head, like, okay, I just need to talk. And Barbara asked me some questions, and I answered them, and it felt really fast, but it was crazy. It was like kind of thrilling, and I got off the stand just feeling so much lighter, and I used my voice, and that was really, really powerful. And getting to see all of the other plaintiff testimony, it was really, really powerful and wonderful to see. It was heavy. It was heavy, really heavy, hearing their stories and all of the struggles that they went through and how that related to me, and seeing there's a sense of solidarity. But yeah, the whole trial process, I like to describe it as a roller coaster. You know, there were ups and downs, and getting to hear all of the plaintiff testimony, then backed up by scientific evidence, was just really powerful. So I guess maybe to move back a little, to talk a little bit about like the harms. I've experienced, wildfires and flooding. As I think we've all experienced in Montana by now, every summer we have really bad wildfire smoke, and that's only been something that's been getting a lot worse recently. Last year, the Yellowstone River flooded really badly, and I live in Livingston, so that's on the bank of the Yellowstone River, and it flooded a whole bunch. There was a home that fell into the river near Gardner. Many homes were evacuated and flooded, and there was a ton of damage wrought on our community, which affected how the summer went. And we have a pretty tourist-based economy, so that a lot of local businesses struggled, and especially coming out of COVID and then sort of getting thrown into this chaos, it was really a really hard time for our community, and for me, thinking about, wow, this feels really real. We've been just sort of like, it felt threatening, and it made me really uncertain. So having gone to trial and getting to use my voice and being heard in court was so, so important, because, I feel very uncertain about my future, and I don't know what's going to happen, but being heard and feeling like we're making progress and how this case is setting a precedent, and there's all this inspiration and excitement and hope, and I think this is really powerful.
Thanks, Eva. That's a hard act to follow, especially being a lawyer. People usually turn their ears off when I start talking, but I'll try to keep it brief and hopefully somewhat entertaining. Before I dive into the order that we received from Judge Seeley, I wanted to provide a little bit of context. Both Barbara and I litigate climate change issues all the time, mostly in federal court, sometimes in state court. And almost always in those cases, we're essentially challenging an action that a government agency took. And never in my career, and I think like really never in the history of climate change litigation, has there been a case where there is so much active storytelling going on in a court. Often, we tell our stories based on voluminous administrative records that federal or state agencies produce as part of their decision-making process. Here we had the actual stories of Eva and her co-plaintiffs. We had the stories being told about climate science by Nobel Prize winning climate scientists who happen to be based here in Montana. And I think it's one of the things that really stood out for me about the trial and about this case is that there are three really big stars of this case. And the first and most important one is the plaintiffs, who, with incredible courage and articulateness, got up in this very intimidating atmosphere and, as Eva just related, told their individual stories, all of which were really different and all of which were equally powerful about how they have been impacted by climate change, the things they worry about with respect to their futures. The other big star of the trial, as Patricia alluded to, was the climate science. This is really the first time that a court has not just considered the science, but actually broken it down. And as Barbara mentioned, it sounds a bit intimidating to say that, well, we got a 103-page order from Judge Seeley, and I think that's about the last thing anyone wants to read unless they're maybe trying to fall asleep at night. But this is really powerful legal writing, and it's incredibly compelling, and it kind of tells the story of climate change and climate change in Montana in a way that is both entertaining and just incredibly instructive in the way that most of the litigation we do really isn't. Usually the court is just deciding, did the agency exceed its authority or not? And here, the climate science was what really was on trial, and it came out very clearly in Judge Seeley's opinion that not only is there no doubt about the climate science, but there's no doubt about the level of damage that's going to happen to Montana, these plaintiffs, and all of us who live here if we don't do something about it. And then the second piece of her opinion, which was really based on the testimony of a lot of our experts, was that the transition to a renewable energy-based economy is not only technologically possible, it's technologically possible now, and really the only things that are standing in the way of that happening are political pressure and economic pressures against that type of transition. So we have not only a huge problem, we also have a solution that is available to us now if we just have the will to go out there and grab it. And I think this case is a big piece of that, and the stories that Eva and her co-plaintiffs told in court in front of Judge Seeley during trial are a huge piece of that, and their voices come through in the opinion. So I'll briefly go over what the order, what that 103 pages said. And I like to think about it as sort of, you throw a rock into a pond and there are all these concentric ripples that come out, and the rock itself is the laws that were being challenged. And as Barbara mentioned, we challenged two laws. One was a law called the State Energy Policy, which is basically enshrined the legislative commitment to a fossil fuel-based economy. And unfortunately, that law was repealed by the 2023 Montana legislature, and that claim was dismissed as moot because the law no longer existed. Judge Seeley held that that claim was moot. We disagreed. We felt like that law was basically just a written articulation of what the state is doing and has been doing for decades past, which is promoting fossil fuel-based energy sources at all costs. But even though that claim was moot and gone by the time we got to trial, we had our other claim, which, as Barbara mentioned, was based on the Montana Environmental Policy Act. Some of you may be familiar with the National Environmental Policy Act. Like NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, what we call MEPA, or the Montana Environmental Policy Act, basically tells state government that it cannot take actions without looking at the environmental consequences of those actions and sharing them with the public and allowing the public to weigh in. So it's essentially a public information law, but it's a very powerful one because it requires state agencies to involve the public, to educate themselves and to educate the people before they take actions that irretrievably commit state resources in a manner that will have harms to the environment. And what Judge Seeley's order held with respect to our challenge to a provision of the Montana Environmental Policy Act that prevented the state from looking at climate change impacts of its actions was that that statutory provision, that law, violated the plaintiff's right to a clean and healthful environment. And so that was sort of the very basic cut and dried legal holding of that 103-page opinion. But where it gets more interesting and more compelling is that she also held that as part of these plaintiffs' right to a clean and healthful environment, and as part of every person in this room's right to a clean and healthful environment, which you're entitled to as a citizen of Montana, part of that individual right includes the right to a stable climate system. And that is one of the things that's truly revolutionary about this judicial opinion. No court has ever held that any constitutional right carries with it, let me back up. No court in the United States has ever held that there is a constitutional right to essentially a livable climate. So that's a really huge deal for Montana. It's a really huge deal for the handful of other states that have similar environmental protection provisions to our Constitution. And it's also a big deal under the federal Constitution and the Juliana case, as Barbara mentioned, because we had a number of other claims in addition to the clean and healthful environment claim. And while the court didn't directly address those other constitutional claims, I think it's an open question following this order to what extent the rights that we have as individuals, as individual American citizens under the US Constitution can be related back to this case. And that's something that we'll just have to wait and see as litigation proceeds in the Juliana case, as litigation proceeds under other state constitutional provisions, and as unrelated litigation proceeds as a result of this case. And so I think that's sort of the third piece that is really worth emphasizing here, which is that while the specific legal holding that Judge Seeley made, that one section of the Montana Environmental Policy Act is unconstitutional, is quite narrow, the opinion has much broader ripples that I think are going to continue to be felt for years to come, assuming that this opinion is upheld on appeal in particular. And it's going to be really interesting for us both in Montana and looking at the country at large to see what those ripple effects are, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And I think this opinion is not the silver bullet that's going to solve climate change, but it's a really important piece of the puzzle, and it provides a roadmap for courts, not just in Montana, not just in states with similar constitutional provisions, but nationally, to talk about climate change, to talk about how climate change harms public health, the psychological impacts of climate change on youth. There are just so many layers to this opinion that I think are incredibly important beyond just the bare legal holding that subsection 201 of the Montana Environmental Policy Act is unconstitutional.
As promised, each of the defendants have a political science Carroll College Cup. So we're now going to have a question and answer session. So just raise your hand if you have a question. I'll bring you the microphone.
All right, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe at the beginning you stated the text of Montana's Constitution was that each person and the state shall maintain and improve a clean and healthful environment for current and future generations. Is that, okay. Just wanted to make sure, because otherwise this question's going to be really stupid. Okay, so if it is if the ruling is upheld and it is found that laws promoting the burning of fossil fuels violate the state constitution, that would be the state not maintaining a clean and healthful environment. Do you think there's also legal basis after this to prosecute individuals for burning fossil fuels because it says each person and the state shall maintain a clean and healthful environment? How might this affect individuals?
Take a crack at it.
That's a great question. I think there are, kind of two layers to this. One is that, as I talked about, sort of the narrow legal holding of the opinion was that this provision of the Montana Environmental Policy Act was unconstitutional. that is a legal provision that really only applies to the state and state agencies. It's the provision that requires the state and its agencies essentially to tell the truth about the environmental impacts of the actions that it takes. So in that sense, I don't see this as sort of a route to go after individuals for driving a car, for example. This case was very much about state action, government action, and what can and can't be done to address climate change, what the state knew when about climate change, and what it has essentially been concealing from its citizens since 2011, which is when this statute was originally passed that we challenged. And so, while you're right that the state constitution not only gives us a right to a clean and healthful environment, it puts on us the onus of helping to protect that. I do not see this opinion as a basis for prosecuting individuals for burning fossil fuels, for example. And I think a really big and important piece of Judge Seeley's order is talking about how individual citizens really are at the mercy of state and federal governments in terms of addressing climate change. As we all know, I think most of us drive cars. In a state like Montana, it's really hard to avoid doing that. When the government and the economic system doesn't make it possible for us to have alternatives to that, there's very little that we can individually do. We can put solar panels on our house, we can do things like that. But in terms of solving the problem of global climate change, it's going to take local, state, and federal government action to address that, and that's what this order was really centered on. Barbara, do you have?
No. Yeah.
Okay, I'm a bit of a law nerd. I just wanted to know how you upheld the preponderance of evidence and like what you argued in regards to that, because I'm really interested to hear.
Yeah, that's a great question. You are a law nerd, that's cool. And so here's the deal, what happened in trial. We spent 5 days putting on our evidence, very compelling evidence, and the state spent like a day and a half, basically putting on witnesses who said, it's not our job, we're just doing what the legislature has told us to do. Basically, they did not put on a case. The one expert that the state decided to put on that all of us as taxpayers paid for, the judge said in her order that she did not give his testimony any weight because it was on cross-examination. It was revealed that he kind of didn't know where he got his numbers from. So it was just basically, it's easy to meet. And so the question is about kind of the standard of evidence and in the standard of preponderance, so if the evidence weighs in your favor, 51%, and when that standard applies, then the judge should rule in your favor. And it was pretty easy to meet any kind of a evidentiary burden when we were really the only parties that put on evidence at all. So, sorry, that sounds a little snarky, but it was kind of how it went.
First off, thank you, Eva. I'm inspired by your commitment. Thank you. And thank you, Barbara and Melissa, for the fine work you did. But my question is, did the state at all, I know they argued that any change would be de minimis and that there was really nothing they could do. Did they at all try to argue that we do not have the constitutional right to a clean environment?
No, they really didn't argue the constitutional provision at all, and I think as folks who are aware, who are paying attention to the legislature, there was sort of a nascent effort to try and get on the ballot a motion to amend the Montana Constitution, the right to a clean and healthful environment. That failed to secure a 2/3 majority vote in the legislature, which is what it would have taken. And just going back to the other point you made, which is, a lot of their argument was originally centered on this idea that, well, we're just Montana, we have barely hit 1 million people, we have a de minimis effect on climate change. The experts that we put on, experts in greenhouse gas emissions and accounting, demonstrated very clearly that Montana puts out more greenhouse gas emissions than many countries that are 7 times our size in terms of population, just because of the intensity of fossil fuel extraction in the state. And so that argument was very clearly debunked when we put our witnesses on, as Barbara talked about. And then once that happened, the state kind of switched to this, well, you know, we can't do anything about it. We lack the discretion to, for example, refuse a permit for a new coal mine. And the judge very clearly called the state out on that claim. She said, it's one way or the other. Either you state you have the discretion to deny these permits based on harms to the environment and the citizens' constitutional rights, or if you don't, these statutes are just de facto unconstitutional. You can't have it both ways.
I'll come to you.
Okay, great. And you're next.
So, this question is for Dr. Heiser.
Dr. Heiser.
So how do you think nuclear energy would fit into a climate, like healthy environment? Do you think that fits into the picture at all? Do you think we should consider it? What effects does nuclear energy have on the environment? Have you looked into that? Just what's your viewpoint?
Climate-wise, nuclear energy is a better thing, right? We're not producing CO2. So yes, and other countries have increased some of their nuclear. I mean, nuclear was mothballed in a lot of places. And actually, I lived in Alaska for a long time. They're looking at small-scale nuclear in villages that, you know, have thousands of barrels of oil shipped to them every year, and that's a thought. The concern about nuclear, of course, is what do you do with the waste? And so there's still potential harms to the environment, right? And it's always a balancing act, even with renewable energy sources. We need to mine lithium and trace elements, you know, so there's going to be an impact, an environmental impact of anything that we do, but whether it's nuclear and the waste, or it's renewable energies and the trace elements that we need to mine, there's going to be an impact. The climate part, you know, nuclear energy is probably not going to cause. It's going to help and reduce, obviously, our greenhouse emissions. So it could be a solution to the greenhouse gas climate issue, but there'll be other problems too.
Thank you.
So my question is that the news coverage seems to be very politically charged, and I feel like this has definitely impacted the public's response. Do you think that this had an impact on the decision that was made, or the future decisions that will be made based on this case?
I'll start with that. That's a good question. And for better, right, for better or for worse, climate change has been politicized. What we did and what we attempted to do in court, though, is really focus on the facts and the law and kind of take it out of that political sphere. And so, and that's what the judge did in her order. I have the utmost confidence in the judiciary, and they're one of our 3 branches of government, and their job is not to be swayed by politics, but really to be, wed to the law as it applies to the facts in a certain case. And so, our goal really is to kind of take it out of that political space and say, this is what the science tells us. These are the real harms that these plaintiffs experienced. And this is what the law says, and this is what Montana's Constitution says. And so the judge took that and did a wonderful job, I think, really kind of very succinctly and articulately laying that all out. And I mean, at least personally, my goal, and I think what needs to happen is that we remove the politics from the climate conversation and just move forward together, on the transition that is just and fair and takes into account the potential environmental harms along the way. So, yeah, good question.
I think that's exactly right. The only thing that I would add is, the science has been politicized, but it's still the science, is still what the facts are. The other piece that I think came out at the trial and was very compelling for the judge, and I think the people who are listening too, is that even if you want to totally ignore the science, if you want to just focus on the economics, there is hands down no question that transitioning to renewables in the long run will save us billions of dollars over the climate damages that we're going to incur if we continue with the status quo. And I think that, I hope that eventually that message will be able to transcend the politics, even if people don't want to believe the science, because it just makes economic sense. And that came through very clearly with economic experts in renewable energy that we put on, with other economic experts that we retained for the purposes of the trial. The amount of money that climate damages are already costing us is truly astronomical, and the cost of transitioning to renewable energy society-wide is a drop in the bucket compared to that.
Other question? Oh, yes.
Thank you. Eva, this is such a powerful example of youth voice creating change. What's your message to us, or what would you like us to know about how we support young people and your concerns today?
I mean, that's a good question. I think staying, hearing our voices and listening to us, because young people have really, really powerful things to say, and we have a unique perspective of the world because we aren't adults. And listening to us and just supporting us and being there for us. This is our future that we have to walk into. So doing what you can, being involved in your local community and trying your best to support the young people out there.
Okay, I'm gonna go up here. What to go first? Oh, no, go ahead.
Yep. First, I want to thank you all for putting on this presentation, providing this information. My question to you is more about the political blowback rather than the legal intricacies. And as you probably well know, there's a particular party in Montana particularly who is resistant to this type of activity. And the two aspects that I kind of take away from their arguments is, one, why Montana probably puts out some small fraction of 1% of greenhouse gases, and why should we bother if China's not going to be part of the solution? And the other half of their argument that I remember is, well, if we do this, you're going to put X number of people out of work in the coal mines. And so, taking aside the legal aspects of this, I wondered if you have ever thought about how you would address those political concerns.
Those are really great questions, and while you're right that they're outside of the legal sphere, they actually often come up in a lot of the work that we do on fossil fuel-based infrastructure. I think the first issue is, why should we have to do anything if we're such a de minimis contributor? And globally, it's true. We are, less than 1%. I guess my response to that, and the response that many of our scientific experts made as well, is that if that's the attitude that we're going to take, there is no solution to climate change. Montana is a disproportionate contributor to climate change and greenhouse gas emissions relative to many other states. We have a heavily fossil fuel dependent economy, and we export a lot of fossil fuels out of state. So relative to other states, we actually do have quite a significant impact, but you're right, it is still small on a global scale. One of the things that one of our economic experts explained in a report that he wrote for this case was that there is actually, and I won't remember the economics term for it, but there is actually a measurable economic effect when a local government, a state government, or a national government undertakes climate action, which is in that it has a ripple effect to neighboring communities, and they are then more likely to take reciprocal action. And so that in itself is a reason to take action, because our actions amplify beyond just what we do here in Montana. So if you want a better reason, then well, if we don't do anything because we're such a small part of it, the problem just isn't going to get solved. That's it. With respect to jobs, that's a really hard issue. We have a lot of fossil fuel-based economies here in Montana, and what I really wish is that our state legislature would start looking at transition support for those communities, because those, especially coal, but certainly oil and gas on a slower timeline, they are going. Like, it's already happening as a result of economic pressure and not political pressure or policy pressure from governments. Coal is now much more expensive than renewable energy, and those communities are already suffering. We should be stepping up as a matter of policy and supporting those communities, training those workers to do something else, and helping them move on to the next step in the inevitable economic shift that is happening, rather than throwing stones and saying, well, if we do this, all of these people are going to be out of work. If we don't do this, those people are eventually going to be out of work anyway, and we're all going to be in much worse trouble economically, physically, and climatologically.
Thank you.
Hello, Wade. Thank you very much. I have one comment and one question for Eva, and a silly question for the three of you. Really silly question. So the comment and the question is, like 2 months ago, I was talking to a friend. She lives in the Netherlands, and she called me and she told me, "Have you seen what those kids did in Montana? Wow, they are heroes." So yes, you are totally your heroes. So yeah. And now I'm going to call her and I'm going to tell her I made one of these heroes. So the question is, and this is connected to some other questions, are you in contact with some other kids, some other young people all around the world? Because this example is something to follow, something everyone should know. Not only 2 months ago when it broke up into the news, but right now we should be talking about this. So do you have any kind of like contact, like I don't know, like a connection, a network? And before giving you back the microphone, this is the silly question. So this is something everyone should know, and the best way is movies. Are you thinking about making a movie of this? Maybe you should talk to people in Hollywood. I mean, this would be a great movie, and everybody will know about it, and everybody will follow your example. So thank you very much.
Well, I mean, starting with the movie question, there is actually a documentary about the federal Juliana case called You Speak Up, and it's on Netflix. So there is something, so if you want to watch it, you should. Following up on your previous question, I'm definitely in contact with my co-plaintiffs, and could probably use to get in contact with other plaintiffs in the Juliana case and also the Hawaii case, which will be going to trial next June. You should probably stay tuned for that. It's going to be really cool, and I'm excited for them. But yeah, I'm not in contact with too many people right now. I'm hoping to be though.
So my question is for you as, just as a young person watching the news and hearing some of your representatives say things such as the young are being manipulated by this law firm, and that, you know, I've heard one say that the plaintiffs in this case are spoiled brats and yada, yada, yada. How does one, did you like expect that going into a case like this, knowing like, yeah, there's gonna be some pushback, there's gonna be, you know, a 3-hour long, essentially like interrogation of me and my intelligence? And my follow-up question on that is, how do you think, especially this case and what your representatives have said over this case, how that's going to affect you guys in the presidential election and the next Montana election?
Yeah, seeing I think initially I did expect maybe a little bit of hesitation around it, and yeah, I have seen that news clip where they call us spoiled brats, and yeah, seeing that is, it's frustrating because it's of course not true, but you also kind of just have to laugh it off. Because it's pretty ridiculous when they make comments like that, spoiled brats. I mean, you can really only think about that for so long before just being like, yeah, that was kind of funny, wasn't it? As for your second question, I'm not sure how will I actually process that, because I was thinking of another answer, and yeah, I don't think I have an answer for that one.
All right, a second question for you guys. This is not cited, I just want to know your opinions on it. Do you believe in the idea of having base energies at least, or backups from fossil fuels, say our fossil fuel storage for national emergencies? Or an example would be the city of Las Vegas can't necessarily run on water or wind power, or hardly even solar would power the city. So in those circumstances, would you believe in having fossil fuels at least as a backup in our country?
Okay. And I'll just say this is, my personal opinion. And I understand what you're saying. Obviously the energy transition is not going to happen overnight, and we'll certainly need to rely on fossil fuels as we work to, fully transition. I guess as far as like the Las Vegas example, I would honestly want to consult as a climate scientist or just someone that could help me understand what the limitations are and how to do that transition in the fullest way possible. Because my understanding is that 100% clean renewable energy is a possibility, and it's a possibility now. And so I guess, but I'm sure there are some, obviously some, steps along the way that we'll need to take to have backups for sure. Melissa, I'm sure you know more about that than I do.
No, I'm not a renewable energy expert either, but I do know that I think we both spent a lot of time listening to our renewable energy expert for this case, who's based at Stanford. He's quite amazing. I sat in on his deposition, I listened to him at trial, I read his expert reports, I've read some other things that he's published. And in terms of just technological feasibility, like Barbara said, 100% renewable energy is technologically feasible now. Do we have the infrastructure in place to do that right now? No. Is fossil energy, as Barbara said, going to be necessary to get us through the transition? Yes. Long term, do I think we need it as a backup to renewables? No, I don't. Everything I've read indicates to me that it's simply not necessary. Eva, do you have an opinion on this?
thank you all for putting on this piece of the story. And I was able to participate in the audience in most of the trial, and I feel really one of the best educational experiences I've ever had. But my question, comment is that back to the first question of and each person. We may not have a legal responsibility, but if we're going to hold someone or some entity responsible for their role in the constitutional aspects of this, we can't pick and choose what part of the Constitution we're following, as far as I can see, and that each of us has. Maybe not a legal, but we have an ethical responsibility to fulfill our role as participants in Montana democracy. And so, what little bit do we have available to us to do as a small state population-wise? We are a headwaters state. We run water to 3 different oceans, and we also run with Held versus Montana. This is a headwater activity, and what comes out of this flows downstream. We don't have any idea the impact of that, but that doesn't mean that we don't have an impact and that we shouldn't really pay attention to what flows downstream from us in relationship to these brave young people who stepped up because they want to have a future, and they want any children that they might have to have a future, and their children to have a future. So from my perspective as a good ancestor, I want to make sure that what flows downstream from Montana, both in the water and in the consciousness that flows as well, it does ripple out, it does cross borders, and I want to, thank you for bringing the conversation to the watershed. It's beautiful work you're doing.
Actually, we'll take another question because we've got to wrap this up. So
I just want to make, you were talking about the constitutions to the lawyers on the panel. You spoke about the individuals we don't want to go after the individuals to bring a case against climate change. But according to Citizens United, corporations are individuals. Can we do anything about suing corporations? Because I know that you said government's really important, and it is, but so are private corporations. Is there anything Montana can do to go again to deal with the corporations?
we have 2 questions here. You can take them as you wish.
First of all, I just want to say thank you for that beautiful analogy. I love the Headwaters State idea, and that what we do here trickles down in so many ways. That's wonderful. To your question, it's a really good point. And there are so many pieces to this puzzle, and the way that we typically try to get at the nugget of this problem is through sort of the permitting side. In other words, what our state government, what the federal government allows corporations to do using state resources on state lands or on federal lands. So that's one piece of the puzzle. What is happening right now, and it's happening at the state level, and many state attorney general's offices are suing those corporations for antitrust type claims, for deceiving the public, similar to sort of the tobacco cases that you're probably familiar with from the 90s, where these corporations had all of this scientific knowledge. They had staff scientists telling them about the impacts of climate change and what will happen if we do nothing, and they hid that information from the government and from the people. And so those state attorney general's offices have created a whole class of cases going directly after those types of corporate interests. We mostly, like I said, focus on government action, but it is happening, and it's a great question because it's a really critical piece of the puzzle.
Any last questions? Last questions from anyone? Okay, your last word.
I'm a 21-year veteran of Department of Environmental Quality. I was a lawyer there until about 2.5 years ago when I retired. So I'm amazed you guys could get this decision, and I sure hope it stands up in our Supreme Court. I guess I just wanted to ask or suggest also another take, which is, right, a few minutes ago I was looking at my phone to try to remember MIPA's language, and one of the things in the Montana Environmental Policy Act handbook is not just the public, which is very important obviously, it's supposed, the studies, the environmental reviews are supposed to educate the decision maker too. And the history of the Montana Environmental Policy Act talks about that you don't want to, you want to think before you act. And as a lawyer who advised the director of DEQ for a long time on different issues, that was something that was really important, because if the director doesn't know, because his people can't go out and find these things and put them into reports, then he or she doesn't know what kind of risks that person is taking to make decisions. So it sounds like maybe a small part, but to me it's really important. The idea is to have good government, not just because the public is watching, which is very important, but because it's important to know what you're doing as a public servant. And I just wanted to mention that because I think appropriately you folks talked a lot about the public, but I also think you don't want your decision makers to be acting blindly. And so I think that's a really important, and the public helps open their eyes for sure, but they shouldn't have to. The decision makers should be able to get that stuff through their own processes, and be required to get it through their own processes.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, Melissa and I both worked in state government before we joined the Western Environmental Law Center and found ourselves advising on the same issues. And yeah, MIPA's purpose is to not only inform the public of the consequences of government action, but also the decision maker and the legislature. If the laws aren't protective enough and they're not adequately protecting our rights in the environment, then the legislature would have then the information to act. And so the head in the stand approach that we challenge really it flows to all of that. And ultimately, of course, our goal is to have the government make the right decision, and they can only do that if they have the information in front of them. So that's a good point.
Okay, let's give a round of applause for our panel. Thank you all for coming. Have a great evening. See you next time. Take good care.